I'm torn between two things, and I'll share, and we can maybe go whichever one feels most alive for you. Excuse me. One is continuing. Where did David go next? Through academic journey and through life experience that brought you here. Like, how do we do a kind of maybe 10-minute synopsis of after being in that childhood experience to
Yeah,
here? And
yeah.
the other one is, man, I don't know how to talk about or be with what's occurring with Israel and Palestine. Feel for you and
Well, that's a
loving
difficult one.
Jewish people and appreciating and celebrating Jewish people at the same time, really not wanting those experiences for anybody, for either the Israeli folks. I don't want them to have what occurred to them, and I don't want Palestinians to have what's occurring to them, and not really knowing how to separate the Jewishness from all that and just highlight the animal or the cruelty where I see it. And I don't have a direct connection. I've never lived in Israel. I've never lived in Palestine. I don't know what it must be like to have the diaspora, as you said earlier, and then like Zionism and all of that. I've just watched documentaries quite a bit to understand, and it seems so complicated.
Yeah, there are different elements. If
Which
we
one
talk
seems
about,
more alive for you? I'm happy to go either of
well,
those
they're
directions.
they're very different. This is very much comparing apples to the Eiffel Tower kind of a thing,
Apples being like your life story for the last 10.
and the Eiffel Tower being this huge towering thing that you kind of can't ignore if you're in Paris. It's just there,
Yeah.
um, and and it's not homely. It's not intrinsically so personal, and it's hard to argue with. Yeah, but because I feel like this is something that you're finding a resonant topic. So let's go for it. Let's talk a little about this very difficult topic.
Yeah.
Um, Not that I'm putting myself out there as someone with huge wisdom to dispense, but I just have my own positioning that's different from yours, with my different background.
Hmm.
Um, and I think one thing to recognize is completely obvious. Humans do bad stuff. Doesn't mean that they're not responsible for it, that you know, that they shouldn't be, in some cases, punished for it in some way or prevented from doing it. It just means whether those people are circus clowns or school teachers or Arabs or Jews, they're humans,
And humans do bad stuff
and they
sometimes.
do especially bad stuff when they're in large groups that feel threatened.
Yeah.
What happens when you have two groups
Feel threatened.
that feel threatened? Whether they feel threatened by each other or not, we're already in a dangerous place.
Yeah.
Yeah? In this particular case, we've got two groups that do feel threatened by each other.
Yeah.
Um, Israel as a political entity was imposed on the region by the colonial powers, especially Britain and France, and the Allies more generally. But it was Palestine was a British territory at the time that Israel was created as a separate entity,
Hmm.
um, and a lot of Arabs have been displaced as the result of the creation of Israel, the various wars that have
Mm-hmm.
moved the effective borderline around, and settlement and military activity and economics, all these things have combined to force many Arabs away from the places that their ancestors, and in some cases they themselves or their parents, lived. Now, contrarily, Jewish Israelis feel threatened, both because not everyone wanted Israel to be there,
Mm-hmm.
including the other Arab states,
Right.
and because that resonates, being under attack resonates with a people who have a recorded history that we tell each other about, of literally thousands of years of being oppressed.
Because when the diaspora
The
folks went to
diaspora
a
was
bunch
the
of
result of
places,
just one action. So
but the places that they
we tell
went, they
ourselves,
weren't.
absolutely, they were often not welcome. They often fought their way in to places, and many of the stories celebrated in the Bible are of Jews, with God's help, taking over places. They escaped from Egypt. They were initially wanted there, but then the Pharaoh worried about the Jews and gradually ramped things up till he was killing children. That's how the story goes. Things were pretty bad for Jews in Egypt, and then the Jews left. So this type of story it's a narrative that Jews have been telling themselves for the whole history of Judaism.
So while on one side they're exceptional, they're chosen by God, and on the other side they're threatened exceptionally as well.
This is the narrative. Yeah, absolutely. You've picked out the two special parts of the narrative that, if you think about, if you had that narrative,
Yeah.
what would you do when you felt threatened? On the one hand, you would say, what we always do is fight. We're strong. We find a way to defeat the enemy. On the other side, you might feel very self-righteous, whatever you did. You might feel that you were carrying out God's will.
Mm. Yeah.
Yeah, these are dangerous elements to combine.
Yeah.
And there are many people who, for whom these things are not just stories; they're the life they are living. And then there are many other people who are politicians and propagandists who are prepared to take advantage of that, whether they believe it or not.
Yeah.
And who can use that to drive a wedge so deep between the different people living in the region that one side is seen by the other as subhuman, not worthy of treatment as a full human being,
To objectify.
they're objectified. They no longer have the rights to a place to live, education, or indeed living at all.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, I think most Jews in Israel are experiencing a very traumatic situation, as are the Arabs.
Yeah.
On the West Bank and certainly in Gaza. Obviously, in Gaza, they're experiencing the very worst possible traumatic situation. They're starving, dealing with diseases, being bombed. Nothing. This is not something I can even imagine.
Yeah.
how should we feel? So one question is, how should we feel about the Israeli government and military? Another is, how should we feel about Israeli Jews who are not uniformly backing this? There are protests against it, but are backing that type of action sufficiently that Netanyahu and the rest of that political gang can carry on, right?
Yeah. Well, the first thing,
And
hold
then,
on one
well,
second. The
let me
first,
ask, let me
yeah,
just before you say, and then there's another group, Jews outside of that.
yeah, that was because
And
where I was
how do we
going.
feel about them? How should we feel about them? How should you feel about me as a Jew? How should I feel about other Jews?
Yeah, yeah, and you hit on it perfectly. How do I? There's a desire for me to separate Israel, is Israel, and Judaism, Jewish people and Israel.
So there's some such difficult questions here. There's the rights and wrongs of the conflict, and I would be considered very left wing in terms of my attitude towards Israeli politics. That is, I am the opposite of a Netanyahu supporter. Many Israelis are the opposite of Netanyahu supporters,
Right.
and many Jews in the US and Britain are the opposite of Netanyahu supporters. They might, among those Jews outside of Israel, there certainly are also those that would be more right wing, but among the left wing, there might be differences in whether people think, well, military action is appropriate in the case of existential danger. And they might think that the initial Palestinian attack justifies any type of reaction because it shows that there's an existential threat to Israel. There are also many Jews outside Israel, many Jews in America who don't feel that way at all. Perhaps feel that what happened in what's been happening in terms of the initial Palestinian aggression was inevitable given the policies of Israel that were squeezing Palestinians in various ways. This was actually there's good reason for saying this was Netanyahu's policy. It wasn't merely that is to, rather than looking for solutions to the problem, to actually keep the temperature going up in the cauldron.
Yeah, we heard terms like open air prisons.
Yeah.
That was a word that I started to
Well, and
hear
if you've been to
around.
Israel, I haven't traveled in Gaza, but I've traveled in the West Bank.
Mm-hmm.
You see the fortifications that the Israeli military has built up around the border, and you won't find the prison camp metaphor far-fetched at all. You'd be like, okay, that's what that looks like. Yeah?
Yeah.
One thing in looking at how to feel about Jewish people who are not directly involved, one thing to be aware of is that there are people who are trying to pressurize you into thinking a certain way. So Trump actively tries to push people into thinking negatively of Jews who don't support Netanyahu and military action. He says they're not proper Jews. Trump is very clearly not in a position to tell any Jew whether they're a proper Jew or not.
For sure.
But he doesn't actually, that the Jews themselves are not the audience. They never are. What he's trying to do, as always, is fan hatred. He likes war. You should remember that. He is not unhappy about there being a war in Israel right now. It provides, so chaos and conflict are what potential authoritarian dictators thrive on.
Because it creates the context for power grabs, for taking more power. Whenever there's a war, we have different rules
It says
for
you
our
need a
powerful
strong authoritarian. This is why,
to protect us from these
yes,
wars.
absolutely. Absolutely. Yes. So he likes that, and the people one of the groups that he's a little bit scared of is more liberal Jews who might fund the democratic or at least anti-Trump activity. And he sees a natural coalition with Netanyahu and Jews who would be very militaristic and support that, and likewise sees as his enemy anyone who would be anti that Netanyahu type stance. And he's able to tie in his stance, Trump's stance, with a lot of nationalist, Christian, fundamentalist rhetoric that sees a special connection with the Holy Land.
Right.
So Trump is kind of wanting to don a mantle of a crusader. There's resonances that stretch back hundreds of years that are still found in modern Christianity that people connect with without even thinking. It's very natural to be supporting military conflict against Arabs, specifically against Muslims, in the Holy Lands. That's not hard for Christians, fundamentalist Christians, to buy into.
Because it plays into a narrative of end times.
A narrative of end times, that narrative of end times stretches back to the Middle Ages when there were crusades.
When the Muslims were pushing into Europe.
They were perceived as a threat, and indeed they were a threat. Yeah.
When you go to Spain, you see
the Moorish kingdom.
Yep.
Of course, the word threat one should use advisedly. The Moors were much more cultured at the time than the Christians, in many ways. So the Moorish palaces, if you look at those, they're beautiful. The architecture and the technology that they were using in terms of, aqueducts and so on, was really quite sophisticated. So,
and at the same time, they were the outgroup.
Well, they became the outgroup. So while the Moors had a kingdom stretching across Portugal and Spain on the one hand, and through the Levant, then was out into the Middle East and around Africa. I mean, that was the Ottoman Empire and related empires. Within that, they were not an outgroup. They were one of the powerful dynastic empires in the world.
Right.
Yeah. But that's why they offered such a threat. Right. And they also, like Christianity and unlike Judaism, it was a proselytizing religion. That is, Muslims wanted to convert people to become Muslims, and Christians wanted to convert people to become Christians. It's like, well, there's a pretty clear tension there.
You know what? I'm realizing that I opened up a topic that it's impossible to satisfy in 10 minutes.
It is impossible to satisfy in 10 minutes. And I think you've come back to the theme of failing at slow thinking by recognizing that this is a topic that deserves slow thinking.
Yeah.
But I don't think that's a reason not to take a little bite every now and again and just check in at how you're feeling about it.